Hello, welcome to Plot Character Voice. I'm Gary Snodgrass. Um, we're going to continue on talking about the different types of plots. Remember the five of them: romance, thriller, mystery, horror, and coming of age. Today we're going to talk about horror. Um, again, why and what about them moves us and makes us interested in those stories? Um, First off, the definition of horror in my mind is the chance that the individual will not survive, usually connected with an unusual threat. This isn't the tribe across the valley. This isn't the lion in the bush. This isn't the army. This is the individual facing a threat, that an existential threat that is unusual or particularly focused on that individual. Um, And again, the why is to overcome death, to survive so that you can uh, procreate for the species, survival of the species. Um, and there's several aspects about the horror plot that is works best if done a certain way. Okay, don't forget we're trying to create that emotion. Fear in the horror case, it's fear, excitement at overcoming the fear, uh, pain, the I like to think of it as a roller coaster of emotions in the sense of it goes up very steep, very quickly, and is very intense. Um, and there are certain things you can do in the plot and the characters to heighten this intensity. The conflict is inborn. Will they survive? Okay, and how? One of the ways you do that is by the characterization. And the reason I'm bringing the characterization up in the plot is because it drives the plot. If you had a 26-year-old Navy SEAL being chased by a monster, or you had an 18-year-old girl being chased by a monster, which creates the biggest conflict? The 18-year-old girl, because she's less likely to survive. That's what we think in our minds. Now then, Buffy and the Buffy Vampire Slayer show it differently, or Katniss. But I'm talking about the basics. So your victim has to be vulnerable, okay, and that needs to be shown in the plot, either by other similar victims being um, taken, or um, having them face a small setback and failure. Um, the way they live their life, all of these things can be used to make the potential victim look vulnerable. It's that vulnerability that is at the core of all of us that has to be demonstrated. That's one. Two, the situation needs to be believable. Okay? If it's aliens from outer space, you need to create a situation where we believe it's aliens from outer space. It also has to be winnable. If you make it to where it's not winnable at the individual level, then it becomes unrealistic and therefore no longer threatening. Okay? So you have to create a situation to where the person is likely to die but is able to overcome that. Okay? Usually at the same time you have the plot arc, you have the character arc, and that needs to match up. In other words, the character gets stronger and better as they go along. It happens in all of them, but it's especially important in horror because this is at the individual level. This is person A against monster B, or even better yet, several monster Bs. And it's the arc of them getting better and stronger that allows them to overcome the monster. Quite often, the story starts with them running to avoid the monster and growing enough to defeat the monster. If they can defeat the monster the first time they come across them, end of story. Um, it's the conflict of staying alive long enough to overcome the monster. Again, why? Internally, emotionally, we want to survive. And any story that shows us how, gives us an example of somebody else who did it, kicks in emotions inside of us. The fear turning to excitement and glee when we win. The chemicals released in the brain are what you're going for. And if they don't get released, then they'll never reach you again. So you want to create a world that is believable with vulnerable characters and monsters who can be defeated but not easily. Now then, there's several things you can do in a horror plot. One is the concept of progress has to be the character arc, the approach of the monster. In other words, we see the monster doing other terrible things, and as they're doing them, they're getting closer and closer to our main character. That's a sense of progress. Or you could have it to where the monster and our main character come in conflict right away. Main character gets away, monster chases, monster chases, monster chases. Again, progress. Um, it's that sense of progress is critical and has to be answered. Will they survive the night? Yes. And again, I say will survive the night. That's a turn of phrase, but really, if you think about it, by setting the horror at night, increases the vulnerability. I mean, just think as a species, the majority of our time was sitting around in a tight circle, staring at the night to make sure we were not taken by a predator. Right? I mean, that's most of our existence. Relying on each other, um, fighting back, and defeating the monsters of the night. I personally think that's why children are so frightened of imaginary monsters. Because inside each of us is that core part of our species that knows there are monsters out there. And we have to be able to defeat them if we're going to survive. Um, on a side note, if your child ever tells you, "Daddy, there's monsters in the under the bed or in the uh, closet," don't tell them there's no such thing as monsters. They know in their gut there is, and you and I know there are. What you can tell them is they're not in the closet, they're not under the bed right now, and I'll check to make sure. So what I'm getting at is we know instinctively that there's monsters. And stories that teach us how to deal with that are extremely satisfying. And it can sometimes be the most intense because it's at the individual level and it's at one of our core fears, the unknown taking us. So keep that in mind when you're doing your plot. You got to show a sense of progress, all right? Otherwise, there's no interest. You've got to give us honest capabilities both of the monster and of the main character. Um, I personally like them with a twist at the end. The main character defeats the monster by some unexpected way. Uh, it just, again, twists are part of a plot that heighten the payoff. Okay? And the payoff that we want for horror is the main character defeats the monster and lives. That's what we're looking for when we read. Okay? We want to doubt whether it's going to happen, but when which makes it even more exciting when it does. So for horror, vulnerable character, vulnerable situation, um, the unknown can be extremely is at the core of what scares us the most. And the unknown can be a a person that we cannot associate with or cannot understand. Psychopaths are really good at this. Most people have no concept of the way the psychopath looks at the world. That's why we find them so interesting. It could be a different world with humans, a different world with something else, a different situation. But the key is at the individual level. We have to identify with the person or the main character. We have to feel their fear. If you make a horror story with nobody ever being afraid, boring. All right? The unknown is a critical part of that. The character not knowing what's going on right away heightens that. It taps into that internal part of us that is afraid of the unknown. Things that we cannot control have a better chance of killing us. We are both predator and prey animals. And the horror plot works when we start out as a prey animal and ends up as a predator animal. Okay? When we defeat the monster, we justify ourselves, our lives. We help the community, and most important of all, we survive. So your plot needs to heighten those aspects. Okay? Failure has consequences. If I identify with the main character closely, I don't want them to die. I will feel pain if they die. So therefore, everything that threatens them is more important to me. If I don't care about your main character, then I won't care if they die. If I don't care if they die, then I'm not scared. Um, and I'm reading the damn book to be scared. Heightened blood pressure, heightened heart rate, flush. Your body will have all of those physical reactions to words on a page. Or it should if you have a good story. So you need to heighten that. And that's one of the reasons why I think horror might work better on a visual level, on like a movie, than it does in a book for a lot of people. Because if you have to go into a lot of description, that lowers the intensity. Okay? So you want to try and capture those instances, those moments, as concise as possible. Just like any fight scene, shorter words, shorter paragraphs, move it along real fast so that it can maintain that intensity. You go into a long internal monologue during the fight with the monster and you're going to ruin the threat or the feeling of fear. So you need to keep all that in account. Now then, on the plot, you want to have it to where at a certain point, the main character realizes they are under a threat. That's the inciting incident. Will I survive or won't I survive? That's after that point, the story is going to be different than it would have been. So that becomes a critical point in the plot, a point where the reader, the main character, and the monster all know the same thing. The monster's after the main character, and the question is who's going to win. So from that point on, the conflict is between the character and the monster. You can have some external conflicts, but I think you need to tone those down. You can have some internal conflicts. Let's go back to external conflicts. Things like he's fighting with his wife. Um, his boss hates him. Should I come out as gay or not? Uh, whether this is a true monster or if it's just a misguided fool. Yeah, you can have them, but don't spend a lot of time on them because everything you do away from the main conflict, will they or won't they survive the night, lowers the threat. You want to have enough external stuff so that we're interested and identify with the main character, but not so much that it takes away. I think out of all five of the main ones, this is where you want the least amount of external issues. The issue is between the main character and the monster. You could also have external conflicts in the sense of there's a group of them and they keep getting wiped out one by one, and who's going to be next, and yada yada yada. Again, fine, but too much of that and it takes away the heightened sense of fear that you want to have in your gut. Um, so the main character figures out there's a monster after him. It could be after somebody else is dead. It could be a failed attempt. This is where the try-fail cycle can really work, but in reverse. He's attacked. He succeeds in getting away, but fails in killing the monster. So what happens? He's attacked, succeeds in getting away, but fails to kill the monster. He's attacked, succeeds in getting away. This time he kills the monster. And again with a twist, if you can. The character's grown. So at the end, if he could not have had the same capability to kill that monster, or she couldn't have the same capability to kill the monster, as they did at the beginning. Either they learned something about themselves, they learned something about the monster, they increased their capabilities, whatever it was. If they could have done at the end, if they could have done that at the very beginning, then why didn't they? And there's your story. You need to have that growth arc in the character and in the plot. I'm trying to think of an example. Halloween is probably the most widely known story of a horror nature. Okay, Jamie Lee Curtis, who plays the ultimate vulnerable, she's babysitting kids. All right, she's a babysitter of kids. Is there anything more vulnerable? And at the end, she kills or supposedly kills the attacker, but it's only because of all the things she's learned and who she has become. Um, some of Stephen King's Salem's Lot is the main character. It's a good example. They could not have defeated the monster if they had not changed as a group and as individuals. Okay, and that's why I love the fact that Stephen King starts the book from them as adults with no memories or very little memories of what actually happened. He's putting them back to where they have to change again. If they went right back into the same situation with all the knowledge they'd already had, it wouldn't be as terrifying. Um, so that's the plot. Is avoiding the monster long enough to grow so that you can become strong enough to defeat the monster. Sort of the story of childhood, right? I mean, staying alive long enough to where you can protect yourself. That's one of the reasons why it resonates so well with people, especially young people. Um, I mean, there's the entire Hollywood industry relies on horror films to keep 1,000 drive-ins in business. And I want to clarify something about horror films. The difference between horror films and slasher films. Remember, we always talk. It's like there's always two types. There's the horror, the dry horror, and then there's the slasher film with blood spurting everywhere and stuff like that. Both of them are to create fear, and both of them have the goal of the person must overcome something to survive the night. The slasher films are going for the emotional shock at the gut level, and are using shock and disgust to create fear. You can also have a horror movie or a horror story to where it's the potential of death creates the fear, and it's the identification with the main character that creates the fear, not the identification of the way of dying that creates the fear. So that you can have a story that is very frightening with very little blood. Um, and you've got to figure out which one you want to do as a storyteller. Remember that the blood and shock are used to create fear. If you can create the fear some other way, I think it's better, because after a while, shock and blood loses its steam. Okay, you need more. And that fear can be created because of the monster's capability. It's so good. The person's vulnerability, the situation. Nobody believes they're after them. There's a monster after them, so you can't get any help. Whatever. You can create that fear, which is what you want to do. You want the reader to get a heightened blood pressure, heightened racing heart, flush, and be nervous and fearful when they're reading it. Okay, the kind of book you don't want to turn the lights off, so that when the monster is defeated, our brains release the satisfaction of chemicals like I'm going to survive. I've learned and grown so that I can survive if this situation ever happens to me. My life is better. Life is good. That's what you're going for. And to do that, you've got to create the fear, and you've got to create a character that can overcome the situation through the course of the story. Like I said, if it's a Navy SEAL or Superman, if Superman was up against Freddy Krueger, it's not a horrible. You're not afraid. Put an 18-year-old babysitter up against Freddy Krueger, and okay, now we got an issue. Now there's something for me to worry about. So by creating that fear, and then you've got to solve it or have them win against the monster. And again, if you can do it with a twist, that's good. Something that nobody else saw, a growth aspects that we did not see until just before it happened, or a bit of information, or the ones I like is a devilish plan that works. And the devilish plan has to be based upon things they've learned throughout the rest of the story. Okay, well, this didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work, but if I put that with this and this and that and tried it this way, maybe I could succeed. If I used the monster's internal motivation, I can maybe force him to act this way, which allows me to kill him by doing this. So your goal here is to create a fear situation that is intense at the individual level, okay? If the entire world is at risk, it's no longer a horror, it's a thriller. If your group of people are against the monster, it can be a thriller unless it's seen from the eyes of an individual. And that individual needs to be the one most likely to die, and therefore more satisfying when they succeed. Again, we're doing this because it's an emotional level, all right? At heart, we're all animals. We have physical reactions to things. And fear and pain are the strongest motivators. Avoidance of fear and pain, the strongest of motivators. So our body reacts quickly and strongly to those. Without thinking about it, without consciously doing it, our body reacts. So your job is to make that happen through plot, character, and voice. For the plot side, it has to be an arc of ever escalating threat, an arc of character growth, an arc based upon true vulnerability that is overcome. Okay? Thank you very much. That's enough for right now.